Hi there, and welcome to the You and I podcast. I've had a really exciting chat today with Allison Pritchard, who heads up our environmental and planning team. Allison has been with the company for nearly 6 years now, and I know, and so does many of our clients, that brings a very different kind of E&P service to our clients, real pragmatic approach to life, and I'm sure you will hear that during our talk today. We're very focused today on the planning system. Is it broken? Can it be fixed? There's a massive pressure on it, which is only going to get worse with net zero. And we talk about all the things that we think actually we could have some solutions to make life easier. Welcome, Alison.
Thanks, James.
We set up the environmental planning team about 6 years ago. And it was very much on the basis that there are too many teams out there that said computer says no. And I think very much you have proven that that doesn't exist. There's no such thing as a no. That there's always a way around things, and I think that you're pragmatic. Well, certainly the way you built the team and looking at that way of trying to be pragmatic about everything has certainly paid dividends for a lot of our clients.
My role is to make sure that we provide that advice in a very client-focused way, so that we can help our clients ultimately achieve what they want to do, which is within the planning system clearly, but build the assets, maintain the assets, and deliver what they need to do in terms of their business plans. And so my experience over that 30-something years with the grey hair to prove it is really to mentor, guide, and help our team, be it, planners, EIA experts, ecologists, archaeologists, the variety of experts that we have, but to ensure that they use their expertise in a really pragmatic, can-do way, so that my experience of risk analysis, strategy, and understanding how you actually get a project delivered goes hand in hand with all their expertise.
Why are we in this situation where it seems to me that everyone is pointing the finger at planning?
Yeah, I mean, I think it almost depends. It doesn't really matter what sector you're in, whether you build houses or whether you build new sewage treatment works. At some point or other, you need to encounter the planning system. And certainly, we deal with planning authorities across the UK on a daily basis. And, there are recurring problems in terms of shortage of planning officers, shortage of funding, massive caseloads, high attrition rates, and morale. And planning officers have got a really hard job at the moment in terms of dealing with quite high pressure situations. And I think the reason that we're in this situation is probably lack of funding, and so there aren't enough officers, but also, that quite difficult work environment and high levels of stress and caseload, it's difficult to attract people into the industry. And of course, let's not forget the pandemic, and when a lot of industries, not just planning, obviously lost a lot of resource and expertise.
How long is it taking on average for you to get a consent through from the first point of contact?
We, I think, as DM, don't have too bad a track record of getting our applications through, but I think what we do differently to some of our competitors is that we try to work with our clients to make sure we don't advise an application is submitted until it's absolutely ready. That's not gold plating it, but it's trying to avoid the obvious omissions. Because of programme and cost, there's quite a lot of contractors and designers are sometimes under pressure to just get, just submit it. There's a lot you can do to a planning submission to make sure it goes through quickly and more smoothly, rather than rushing in something has got a few things lacking, or that perhaps hasn't got the full information for a full planning application. We do try to make sure our clients do put as much in as they can at that point, because we find then that although it might take an extra 2 weeks perhaps, or perhaps even 3 weeks to delay the submission, we're then getting through the process more quickly, because when it's reviewed, officers can see that there's everything's there that they need, and then they're more comfortable to process it. Whereas we do know with some of our competitors are submitting planning, and we know clients are frustrated because that application is then stuck in the system for months and months, with countless iterations needed for submission and extensions of time. And there's also an element of goodwill, really. We see our role as to try to help planning officers to make a submission something that they can deal with, that's comprehensive enough, not gold-plated, but comprehensive, and can be dealt with efficiently. if there are lots of things missing and it's just making their life harder, people are human. I just fear that, would you deal with something that's quite straightforward and is everything there, or would you deal with oh goodness, that's missing, and have I got the appetite to deal with that today? And I just think human nature would mean that might not be the one that you deal with at the top of your list. DM, we have a good reputation for being very professional at what we do. And I think that helps all of our clients then, because when you're submitting regularly to, on a national basis to planning authorities all over the country, there's much to be said about, yeah, that's another DM one. So we know that could be an easy win because it's all there.
But do you find that you're having to kind of help some of these planning officers, certainly with the permitted development rights, because they are very, very niche, very, very sort of specific? And
yes, again, it goes back to the thoroughness of what you're submitting. Our supporting statements try to be succinct, but nevertheless, step by step, guide the planning officers through the arguments we're making as to, which legislation we're quoting, which section, which part, etc., so that they can navigate for themselves the reasoning and the justification that we are providing to say, this is why, in our view, is permitted development, or whatever the case is that we're making. And I think that's not only helpful to them, but hopefully it's helpful to the client as well, because it's very easy when you're in an exposed public position and lots of people are sometimes queuing up, and what with social media as it is, to criticise decisions and to argue that it's the wrong decision. So it's very easy to take a view of saying no and refusing things, because actually that, is quicker often, and you're less likely to get challenge from members of the public or third parties and that kind of thing. Yes, the developer may appeal, but it's almost, I can understand why, from a planning officer perspective, that might be a safer bet. So from a DM perspective, we see our role to make the life of a planning officer, to have that confidence and to have that reassurance that everything there is set out so they can see why a consenting position in terms of a yes and granting consent is actually an appropriate thing to do, because actually, the research is done for them and the answer is there for them.
But just moving then on to the actual legislation, I sat at a very interesting conference where they did talk about planning, and I was interested, believe it or not, Alison.
Go all day?
I did. I went all day. And they were talking about DCOs and the that's a relatively new bit of legislation that's out there. And generally it's working pretty well. However, what was quite interesting for me is looking at the timeline that they set out. So when we originally did DCOs back in the day, on the early wind farms, those kind of things, it would take 2 years to get through the whole process. I think the average timescale now is nearly 4.5, if not 5 years to get through DCO. And my worry is that we can talk about legislation, we can talk about that it's broken, but there's an example of new legislation that is aimed to make projects happen quickly, which in the true British way, it did work for about 12 months. And then good old Brits have thrown spanners in the works to try and slow the process down and added complication where perhaps it isn't needed. To elongate the process. And do you think anything that's brought in the future will have a similar journey?
I think one of the reasons the DCO process has slowed is the lack of resource with those the Natural Englands, the EA, Historic England, etc. So I think part of the process is aimed at that. And yes, as you in your delicate style have suggested, that members of the public obviously have the opportunity to challenge and to voice opinion. And I think that's always going to be, the balance in planning, isn't it? Because if you give powers to centrally to make decisions, then there will be discussion and debate to say that, you have central government imposing conditions on local communities and they're taking the brunt of the sort of national benefit, but communities are taking the impact. So you'll have that criticism. But obviously, if you devolve that power to local people and communities and locally legislative sort of committees, then you are giving people their voice, but when you give people a voice, it often takes longer to do anything. So there's a really, really difficult line to tread. And I think what Labour have said since they've come to power is that, particularly in the context of houses, they have to be built somewhere. And if you keep saying no to wherever they're built, then there won't be any. And so at some point there has to be a compromise. Now, how they're going to solve that, I'm not sure it's been set out yet. But that has always been the dilemma with planning. And if you give the communities, the members of the public, a say, then it slows everything up. And as I say, the DCO process has then been compounded by the lack of resource within statutory consultees. So it's had the double whammy on the DCO impact.
They've announced in the King's speech that they're going to review planning, they're going to review compulsory purchase, which is another topic altogether. But what do you think is there a golden bullet here that's actually going to fix it all? Or do you think it's talking about what you were just talking about? Do you think actually we are going to see more centralised decision making? Because actually a lot of these projects are built in rural areas. I'm being a bit facetious here, but rural areas, they're not necessarily vote winning areas for this government. Actually, we've got to build it somewhere. I mean, he's already signed off, I think, 2,600 acre solar site with 3 days of looking at. So I don't know. Is that where you see it going?
I think ultimately any decisions need to be dealt with by resource. And I think whether you look centrally or locally, at the moment, there's a lack of resource in the professionals needed to help determine applications, be it the planners, be it ecologists, be it, heritage experts, etc. So I think training and skill shortages and getting people into professions will have the medium-term benefit. Clearly, that's not going to have a short-term benefit. So there may have to be a two-pronged sort of approach to this.
Do you think then that actually the legislation is not broke and actually it's more about resourcing up and almost having more people say you can shrink some of the deadlines down?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's certainly some legislation needs review. I think there has to be sometimes a common sense approach to some of this. I think local opinion is sometimes swaying policy nationally. I think, a lot of money has been wasted, I think, at local level on the planning appeals that probably weren't necessary, and that local members able to determine applications are under an awful lot of pressure. And I do wonder what training they get. Some people might say, well, are local members making political decisions? Well, you could say they are, but then I suppose you could argue, well, what training have they been given, proper training, to allow them to make informed choices about, whether the need for development is, the number of applications that can be determined at local authorities that go against officer recommendation, that trigger appeals, and then developers appeal and then win. That can delay, any sort of application a year or more. Now, luckily, in utilities and infrastructure, that situation isn't as common as, say, residential and housing and that kind of thing. But it's nevertheless drawing on resource of planners and ecologists and everyone else at the local authority level. And I think that mindset needs to change. And I think there has to be probably greater community benefit for people to endorse applications. The water sector clearly is a very topical one at the moment in terms of environmental effects. Criticism perhaps of, has there been enough funding over previous AMPs? You could say yes and no to that. But where we are is that we have a situation where the level and quantity of work needed in the next AMP is enormous, unprecedented. And a lot of that work is being demanded to improve environmental conditions, particularly with combined sewer outfall, CSOs and water quality and sea. And yet I have been involved with a number of planning applications for those types of development that will improve water quality. And yet we've had to battle with members of the public and councillors who are opposing it, because I'm not sure either it was resentment that they should have been done before and it's due to lack of investment, but nevertheless, it's still delaying the improvement that was trying to be made by the applicant. And I wonder whether people understand what some of the applications are for and whether they do understand the benefits, and whether sectors and industry, whether that's something that can be improved. But there also has to be an element of people willing to listen.
What's quite interesting to me is that the water industry are hitting the headlines for all the wrong reasons. They're they've done wrong. They have done some bad things. Well, I think they hold their hands up in terms of what they are putting into the rivers. What seems strange to me, though, is that the planning system with some of these projects works against it, because I think Joe Public will see an application in with a water company's name on it and immediately try and do something to stop it happening. Is that what you're seing?
Yeah, I mean, I think we have had some planning applications which have certainly been stalled. We haven't had refusals. We've managed to turn around public opinion, but it's been quite difficult when sometimes members of the public and councillors actually are fairly ignorant in a kind way, I think, to some of the improvements that the development is intending to provide. I mean, I think we have a role in that as well as our clients. I mean, I think in terms of stakeholder engagement, public engagement, obviously COVID prevented a lot of that happening. The days of boards in the parish hall, and people coming to read them, stalled for some time. I think those things are coming back, but there are online opportunities now, in terms of us hosting websites and information. And we do that with our clients, but I think we probably all in the industry need to sort of step up and try to make that education piece a greater focus, because people do care and they're obviously passionate. And I think we just have that responsibility to make them realise that actually by facilitating and supporting some of these developments and collaborating with water companies and the applicants, then actually their aim of getting improved water quality and that sort of ability for, use of the water, be it the rivers and seas or whatever, be it, kayaking, swimming, surfing, whatever you want to do in it, that water quality and that quality of life that people are seeking, it's a benefit for all of us.
There's a massive good news story here, which I think is being missed. And I think, we've all got to, I agree totally what you said, is we've all got to work together to try and make sure the headlines are the right headlines rather than the wrong headlines. And I think that is absolutely through getting the story right, which again links to planning, because if you're going to put in a big development, you've got to get that story right from the beginning and focus it on the right areas. And I think, we can, if we get it right, we could turn this whole negative story back round to a good one.
And I think, one of the elements of our advice to clients is also, about brand reputation and how this might be seen by customers and members of the public. Because although we do champion permitted development rights, because that's what they're there for, that's why they've been given these statutory powers, we do advise our clients, although it's not a mandatory thing for a permitted development scheme to go through public consultation, but we do, from a brand and a customer perspective, really encourage our clients to have that participation, so that it gives residents and local people an opportunity to be told what's planned and how it may impact on them, and for them to have that input. Because obviously from a planning application perspective, they may be formally notified, but with a permitted development type of sort of activity, that isn't necessarily the case. And so we do explain to designers and engineers and project managers that that's the process, and therefore, they need to still have that brand and customer focus to ensure that, residents know why there's suddenly, 3 or 4 lorries going past their house that they're not used to, just because people want to know what's going on in their community.
And I think you hit the word customer there is absolutely key to all of this. And I think, our clients, ignore the customer at their peril, and they really don't. And I think that's what's got to come out, is that, customer is king to them. And that has always been our remit, whatever we're doing for them, whatever service. And I think that needs to be out there so that they realise. Just bringing us back then to one of the kind of what to me sounds like where your key concern is this whole bit around people, really, and in terms of having the right skills in the industry, whether it be in the planning departments in local authorities or within actual project teams. What do you think are some of the solutions that we could go out and help clients so they can achieve the goals? Because I think you and I have sat in a number of meetings, I know, and raised various concerns. I think even before the election was even a wish list on somebody's list, but we've talked to them about some of our concerns about what the future holds for them. They've got these huge programs they wanted to try and achieve, and like you've rightly pointed out, we see the biggest risk is actually just things sitting stagnating because no one's there to make the decisions. So how do you think we can help our clients, whether it's a huge project, a small project, whatever it is? What do you think we can do to help that?
Well, there has to be resource. I mean, everyone has to do their piece to that to help improve the amount of resource of professionals in the industry. From a DM perspective, we've signed our first agreement this year for environment planning team with UE to have apprentice planners. So we've got 5 starting in the autumn. They'll be starting on an accredited degree course for the RTPI. Clearly, others can follow suit and try to build that resource and future planning into the industry generally. We are lucky in that our focus on utilities infrastructure means, the team know the various legislation inside out. So when we do work with our clients, one of the first things we challenge is, what are they trying to achieve? Not what do you want to build? What are you trying to achieve? And are there various design elements and different processes that you can achieve that? So that we can hopefully almost unpick what they believe is their solution and how they want to do it, and challenge where does it need to be, how big does it need to be, when do you want to build it, can it be broken into smaller parts instead of one large building, can it be done at a different time of year, all sorts of things, so that potentially permissive development rights might be used, perhaps it doesn't trigger any protected species issues because there isn't any impact because it's not done at a certain time of year, all sorts of things like that, just to go back to first principles and to try to navigate, as I've said, a way of potentially not triggering the need for planning at all, but to use the statutory powers. And it's surprising how effective that can be. And when we do work with our clients, we quite like to try and see a portfolio of their projects, and so then we can almost triage those and say, right, okay, well, these we can now remove from planning altogether. These ones actually should be relatively straightforward. These other ones, either because of what you want to build or perhaps which planning authority you need to liaise with, we could advise that the lead-in time or the likely time to get consent may be longer for whatever reason. And so it's trying to guide their program to help. But also, we're encouraging our clients to give us that sort of future view of the quantity and type of application that they envisage or development they envisage, so that it equips us with the opportunity to go and talk to local planning officers and speak to them about our clients' future workload, as it were. So it helps them with their resourcing, and they can foresee perhaps what caseload they might have. There are other things like planning performance agreements that exist. Yes, our clients would have to pay for that process, but if we can go and speak to a local authority and explain, well, there's X number of applications needed over the next 18 months, 2 years or something, I just wonder whether there are opportunities to work more collaboratively so that there's better visibility, and also potentially opportunities to fund officers through a PPA, either as an industry or by certain clients, so that there's a recognition that collaboration will hopefully help both parties in terms of clients as well as local authorities to try to hit the end goal, because ultimately the end goal is for the client to be able to build and deliver and commission what it is they need to build.
So, you mentioned performance planning agreements there. Just explain that in a bit more detail, because that sounds like quite an interesting route.
Yeah, it's not necessarily a route that people feel they should have to go down, but we're finding increasingly that large-scale developments, particularly perhaps residential or perhaps large solar, the developer enters into what's called a PPA, a planning performance agreement, with a local authority. Often that is because, or traditionally perhaps that's because, it's a very large application and they want a sort of a a first-class service from the local planning authority, and there's a legal agreement in place where the applicant will pay X £1,000 to the local authority, and it's not a bribe or a bung. It's to help the authority fund some extra resource that can be dedicated to an officer, or some additional time that can be dedicated to dealing with the application that's being presented to them by the applicant. Now, there is an argument to say, why should our clients be paying for that when they already have to pay quite a substantial planning application fee? I guess the argument is, if so many applicants are doing that, it might mean that the normal service may deteriorate further, because authorities might be inclined, and I'm not saying they are, but there is an argument to say they may just deal with those applicants with planning performance agreements in place first, because that's giving them more money. And although that should be additional resource, if there aren't many officers out there to recruit, it might just be extra funding for the authority. So we are finding some clients are willing and increasingly keen to enter into PPAs so that they can arguably jump the queue, I suppose somebody could criticise to say. Not everyone's doing it, and we're not telling our clients to do it, but in some authorities where the performance figures of determination of applications is low, it could be one short-term solution. It's a bit of a sticky plaster over a wound, as opposed to solving it's not a cure.
You're sitting around the table with Keir and Ed Miliband, right? And they say, come on, Alison, what is the single thing that's going to make the biggest difference to making us achieve what we want to achieve with our net zero targets, get these projects consented and constructed? What would you tell them?
Could I have two?
I knew you'd want more than one. Go on, you can have two. Go on.
Resource and pragmatism. Because you need more people, but you need people with the right attitude. And that's not necessarily gun-ho, develop, but it's having that right proportion of common sense to know what's appropriate or what isn't, and how it can be then tailored or modelled so actually it can happen in an appropriate way. Because there's a lot of people that can just say no, but there's ultimately development needs to happen in a proportionate manner in the right place. And as long as you've got people with the skills to recognise the right things as well as the wrong things, but then be able to do something about it because they've got the experience and the knowledge, and that's the problem.
I think that's a tough call, isn't it? Because I think, as we know, in our own world, pragmatism is quite hard to find, certainly on the planning side.
Well, I don't know. I might be a bit unfair, but I think it comes often with experience, and experience can often take time, or you need the right mentors in place before they disappear, so that they can pass on that advice.
Yeah, I worry that pragmatism. I agree with what you said, but I worry that we're not going to get that pragmatism happening quick enough. And we haven't got the experience there. I think there's been an announcement they want another X thousand more planners coming to the system. Well, unfortunately, they're not sitting at home waiting for the call. They don't exist. And I think to get those pragmatic planners in place is going to be a real tall order, in which case I think possibly the only answer is then actually is legislation changes to really clearly set it out.
Or centralising some more decision-making in the short term until there's enough resource locally. But again, that's probably not a vote win.
Great. Thank you very much for your insights.
You're welcome, James.
It's been great. Thank you very much.